Yeah, all right. So to everyone here, this is Fernando Rosas, kind of giving a talk on a new approach to operationalizing emergence as a computational phenomenon. Um, yeah, Fernando's great. I'm very excited to have him here. Uh, I think I'll just let him get on with it, and then yeah, if anyone has any questions, that are like technical, feel free to raise them using the Q&A feature drawing, and I'll uh, draw Fernando's attention to them. And then any longer musings or more open-ended questions uh, will be covered at the end. We should have quite a bit of time at the end for questions. So yeah, without further ado, go for it, Fernando.
Thank you, Clem. I'm super, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really excited about this. And yeah, let me share my slides. So can you see everything well? Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about emergence. On purpose, I didn't focus the presentation towards AI because I feel that there is so much possibilities in this that I prefer to give a more broad presentation on this topic that is still very new, I think. I mean, people have been talking about emergence for ages, but I feel the more strong understanding and grasping and control of this is pretty recent. So my choice was to make a general presentation, and hopefully from what I will present, then we can discuss more specific ways to apply this to all sort of things related with AI. So, emergence. We, at least I'm excited about emergence. We all have the experience of, for example, being in the sunset and seeing the birds interacting in interesting ways. For example, here they are forming this kind of meta bird and organisms behaving together in a way that it seems that a meta organism is emerging from them. So all of this is super exciting. And there is an intuition that I have, and many of my colleagues also have, that could be helpful if we understand what is this, how does it work exactly, and things like that. But before that, what the hell is emergence specifically? And I will work on the assumption that we all have an intuition on what is emergence. So for example, if we see emergence happening, for example, in this video, you see something happening that you can recognize it intuitively. Like there is something going on about how, for example, these small individuals are collaborating or working together in order to interact with this dog. And there is something interesting about how they are going about. So I will assume that we identify when we see it, even though we might not find it very easy to put our finger on what exactly is going on and how it's working. So I will assume that the intuition on which we can build. Now, the whole presentation is about trying to specify this and trying to operationalize emergence in a way that is helpful. So the presentation is going to be divided in 4 parts. First, I will argue in favor of formal approaches to emergence. So we have a very extended literature on emergence from the philosophy world. And I will argue that it's a very good idea to have a parallel strand based on mathematics. After that, I will review 2 approaches to operationalize emergence, one based on information decomposition and one based on computational closure. And then I will wrap up with some take-home messages to take some ideas home. So that's the plan. So let's do it. So to start, when talking about emergence, it's good to consider options in terms of metaphysics. And my general strategy will be not to avoid metaphysics, but to keep them at minimum. So we have lightweight metaphysics. So there are different choices in terms of, for example, we could say the world is the only thing that matters in the world is reductionism. So for example, when you see a duck is just a machine. And when you see a brain, the brain is another machine. And the only difference between a machine, a duck, and a brain is that the duck is more complicated than standard machines like cars and stuff like that. And human brains, for example, in this picture, are more complicated than ducks. So it's just a matter of qualitative distinction. There's only a quantitative distinction. There's no qualitative distinction. It's just the same thing, but because it's smaller and more packed, it gives the impression of difference, although there's not really any difference. So that would be, and the only thing that is going on is just physics. There is nothing more. Another approach is to say, well, even though physics is great, it doesn't explain everything. And an interesting thought experiment is that to say, okay, let's assume we have the perfect physics of the small. So we have perfect string theory, explain everything at the micro level. Can we predict social phenomena like communism? And everyone outside physics departments will say, no, even if we have the theory, we will not be able to do such predictions. And the key question is why? Why even a complete theory of physics would not be able to explain some things? So if we accept that, then there are two ways to go about it. One is to say the impossibility holds in principle. So it simply cannot be done. And there is this thing called strong emergence, where there are macroscopic features, big things that have irreducible causal power. So they can do things that cannot be explained in terms of what the small parts can do. So big things have causal power that cannot be reduced to the causal power of the small things. This is one possibility. Another possibility is to say the impossibility to explain the big from the small is just a practical impossibility. And that is typically associated with ideas of weak emergence. So from this perspective, the causal power of macroscopic features is always reducible. The only it's just a computational problem. Is not practical to do it, but in principle, it could be done if we would have infinite time and infinite computational resources and stuff like that. So in principle, it seems we have these three options. So either we adopt reductionism, or we adopt strong emergentism, or some type of weak emergentism. And if we take those two options, those three options, and we ask, is emergence a reality or an illusion? Is it possible for a big thing to have causal power that is not reducible in terms of the causal power of the small things? A reductionist person would say, hell no, absolutely no. A strong emergentist would say, of course, yes, in some special cases, like maybe consciousness, maybe macroeconomic respect to microeconomics, depends who you ask. And weak emergentists would say, in some cases, it looks like emergence, but it's never emergence. So it's just an appearance, it's just an epiphenomenon. And this is why I personally, how I see this type of discussions is not very productive, because nothing is very well defined. What is causal power exactly? And causal power is one of these things that the more you think about it, the more confusing it becomes, even though in the beginning it might seem simple. So causal power is a big thing. What the hell are we talking about? Second, what does it mean to reduce? Even if we understand what is causal power, what it means to reduce it from one scale to the next. Then, can we adopt some type of science perspective where we try to reproduce our problem in a minimal, simpler scenario, and we try to reason about it? Instead of trying to solve the big picture in one shot, let's try to make some toy models, play with them, and try to see what we can get out of them. And can we measure something? And from my perspective, it would be very nice if some of these discussions could lead to something that could help empirical science. So my approach to this is that, in my view, there are two extremes. One is crazy emergence, like things that are not scientific. You cannot really study them scientifically because they are just violating fundamental, they cannot be measured or things like that. I'm not interested in that because I find it limiting, that perspective. Then you have the other extreme where emergence is being explained away. So there's nothing to be seen, really. There's nothing there. I also don't find it so interesting, that approach. And I'm interested in possibilities in between, to explore the space of options where we can assume something and we can get something out of that. And that is what I'm basically doing and what I will talk about. So what type of options are in between these two extreme stances? And to summarize the point, my interest is to build philosophically lightweight frameworks to reason about emergence that allow us to first formally establish hypotheses about emergence. Like, what exactly do we mean when we say this is emerging from this? And secondly, how to verify those hypotheses on data. So I would not like to be in a situation where I convince you about emergence in a case. I would like to formally establish the hypothesis, then do an experiment and let the data decide if my hypothesis was right or wrong. But it's not a matter of argumentation. And that means to turn emergence into something useful for empirical science, basically. So that's the plan. Now, philosophy of emergence has a long tradition, is almost as old as philosophy itself. And the mathematics of emergence, in contrast, they don't have such a long tradition. They have roughly 15 years, which is not a lot. So I'm not implying that I think math should replace philosophy, not at all. I think there's two types of ways of thinking. They have the potential to very strongly complement each other. And what I think math can offer to the picture is, first, mathematics is very good to guide us in complicated spaces. Like, for example, when you have to reason about infinite dimensional spaces, if you try to use your intuition, you're dead. You're going to get wrong results, actually. But mathematics can handhold you through those complicated terrains, and you can get some very rigorous understanding of things that your intuition could lead you astray. That's one thing. The second point is that math allows us to make intuitions very precise. And once you have that precision, you can test that thing on data and you can see if that is pragmatically useful or not. So those are the type of things that I think a mathematical approach to emergence can bring on. And I see, hopefully, a virtuous circle here, because in philosophy, we ask, what is the nature of emergence? And that is not exactly what we ask when we do engineering of it, that it would be the other extreme. In the other case, we are using emergence for something. So we could ask, is emergent going to explain how the brain works? Or is emergent going to explain how big AI systems work? So we are using it for something, and not necessarily you're focusing so much on the nature of it, but when you use it, you understand better how it is. So I see a lot of potential in having these two ways of thinking going in tandem. And the good news is that in the last 15 years, there has been a number of proposals of equations, of mathematical quantities that are trying to capture different aspects of emergence. The good news is that all these theories are correct. They are logically consistent. They are not doing anything illogical or meta-scientific or anything. The open questions are still, even though these theories have already some years, is what exactly each of these theories is capturing. And second, what is the empirical potential of this thing? So what kind of practical problem we can address with these measures? And I will talk in the rest of the presentation on some of this. So good, that is the general introduction. Now let's go into one way to measure emergence. So to formalize things a little bit, we are going to consider a scenario which is a system with n parts. So it could be a group of birds flying together, and each of the parts is going to be indexed by a variable x. So x uppercase 1 would be the first bird, uppercase 2, the second, etc. And they're going to have some time dynamics. So the index t indexes at what time you're measuring the variable. And we're going to measure the different variables at different time points, and that is going to generate this multivariate dynamics that define how the system is evolving. Secondly, that is the micro description of the system. Then we are going to have a coarse-grained description, the variable that we are going to denote as b sub t, and that is a function of the micro. So we are going to require the macro variable to be a function of the micro. That means it's a coarse graining. It's a simplified description of the micro. So, and the nice thing of this is that the microevolution of the system via this coarse graining will induce a dynamic on B. also. So V itself will have its own dynamic. And the whole game we're going to play is to contrast the dynamic of the X's versus the dynamic of the V, and see in what situations there are interesting relationships between this. And in particular, the theory that I will present predicts that there are two different types of emergent behavior. One is related, we are going to describe as causal decoupling, and that means that the V, the variable, the macro variable, is causing itself in a way that cannot be explained from the micro. And another flavor, that is the variable V, is causing what the parts of the system will be doing in the future. So for example, the whole flock could determine what the first bird is going to do in the future. And we call that downward causation because the big thing is affecting the evolution of the small things. And let me explain exactly how are we going to arrive to that conclusion. So the starting point is a definition. And the definition is that we're going to say a supervenient variable, coarse graining V, exhibits causal emergence with respect to the substrate X if there is, and the meaning of this is there is unique information given by V at time t about the future microstate that cannot be found in the parts of the system when measured at time t. So let me explain exactly what is the meaning of that. Let's say we have a flock of birds. So each of the x's are the position of a different bird, and the vector x from t upper 1 to t upper n is the position of the n birds. Let's say v is a function of the whole group of birds. We can say it's the center of mass of the flock. And then we ask, is the position of the center of mass at time t giving some information about the future position of some of the birds that cannot be found in the position of each of the birds at time t? And a fair counter argument would be to say, how could V have information that cannot be found in all the x's? Because V is a coarse graining of the x's, so it doesn't make sense that there would be some information in V that I couldn't find in the x's. So the caveat here is that when this is unique with respect to what you can find in the parts by themselves, and not in the parts when considered all together. So you look at part 1 and you try to get information, and you see if you could get that information, the information given by V, from x1 alone or not. And then you forget about x1 and you look at x2 and you see, can you find that information? And you do that a number of times. So that's the crucial distinction. There's information that is in the parts and information that is in the whole. And the emergence would be when V is capturing some information that is in the whole, but is not in the parts. That is the essence of this definition. Now, up to this point, I haven't done anything really. I am just putting forward a definition. And in my opinion, mathematical theory, the value of a mathematical theory is the number of theorems divided on the number of definitions. So we have to see what consequences this definition has. Yes, there are questions?
Yeah, there's a couple questions from the audience. The first is just a technical question of, is the unique information term defined in information theoretic terms?
Mm.
Which the answer is yes. And then the second question is, what kind of function is f? For example, is it deterministic or surjective?
Yeah, let me ask, the second is easier. The f is usually a mathematical function, so we're assuming that x sub t is a vector of numbers, and then f is any function, any mathematical function that gives you another number or another vector. So it's very general, it can be anything. You can generalize this a little bit more, but for the sake of simplicity, I will not do it. If you're interested, we can discuss later. But in principle, just think it's a simple mathematical function. Now, the question about how is defined the unique information is an interesting one. There are different ways to operationalize what we mean with unique information, and that this is an active area of research. So there is space for wiggling and getting confused there. But what I will show you is that we don't need to fix a specific way of measuring unique information. What I will show you later is that the theory gives you a bound for this property that is enough for our purposes. So we will work in practice with a lower bound of this, and which is completely defined in information theory terms in terms of entropies and mutual informations, and then that and I'm getting ahead of myself, but is low dimensional, so is scalable, etc. If you would need to work with this directly, it's very hard to compute in practice in any system, real system of big system. But there are some bounds that we're going to see later that are the ones that allow you to do real work. I hope that answered the questions. If there are any other questions, please let me know. So, as I was saying before, the value of a definition is the theorems that you can derive from it. So let's see what are the theorems that come from this definition. Before the theorems, let me give you a minimal example of emergence based on this idea. Here we have a system with two parts only, binary. So each of the parts can be on and off. Let's say black is off, white is on, and they are blinking on, then off, then on, off, and they do that. And the rule is that we can initialize them randomly, but the system, the way we create this toy model, is that with very high probability, the parity is going to be preserved. And the parity means, are they different or not? So in the initial condition here, they are equally on. So with very high probability, they're going to stay the same. And we see they're the same on, the same off, the same on. So for very long, they stay the same. And then with low probability, they're going to flip to be different. So, and there is a point where they go from on to on off. And then they're different. And with high probability, they will stay different, but they can either do on off or off on with completely random probability. And they are going to keep different for a while, and at some point they're going to flip again to stay being the same. And if you do the math of this, you're going to see that there is absolutely no relationship between what one is doing at one time point. So if you tell me one was on in the first time point, what is happening in the future? You have no idea, because that has no consequence. That has no causal power to anything that will happen in the future. If you tell me x2 was on the first time point, that has no causal power at all. So each of the agents by themselves, they have no causal power. They cannot do anything. They cannot steer the system. However, the two together, they have causal power. That means if they are the same, they're going to stay the same. So the parity has unique information about the future that cannot be found in neither of the parts. And if you have F as the parity of these two, that would be an emergent feature of this system. I hope that gives a bit of grasping of what I mean with all this. We're going to give more examples later, but this is a toy model of what I mean with emergence in this case. So now with the theorems. The first theorem says that to define emergence here, we need a function. So we need a B, we need an F. And if we don't have them, we cannot operate because emergence is based on emergent things. But you could ask the question, is there any intrinsic characteristic on X that allows it to have emergent features on top? And the answer is yes. And the answer is something called synergy, which the synergy is an information theoretic quantity about the information given by groups that are not given by parts. And I hope my previous explanation makes this plausible. So it's not that we're defining emergence as synergy, we're defining it as unique information, but this definition leads to the implication that a system possesses some emergent feature if and only if it has synergy from the parts at time t with respect to the whole feature at time t prime. So this is the first result. This is a result. This is not a definition. That emergence is equivalent to synergy. Then, if we do some mathematics on this, which I will not explain in detail, but if anyone is interested, we can discuss this later. What happens from the framework of information decomposition, where synergy is defined, we start doing some math and some operations that are not very complicated, and we arrive to the conclusion that the synergy, that is this capability to emergence, can be decomposed in two terms. And these two terms are naturally associated with what one would normally naturally describe as causal decoupling meaning the emergent feature is predicting itself, versus the downward causation, that is, the emergent feature is predicting not itself, but the future of some of the parts. So the interesting thing is that the mathematics are telling us that there are two types of emergence, and it's not a matter of, oh, I thought that because I liked it. This is a consequence of the algebraic structure of all these quantities. So up to this point, I would say this is a very beautiful theory, but up to this point is not a very useful theory in practice. And the whole power, empirical power of the theory comes from the third theorem, that says that there is a sufficient, although not necessary, condition for emergence. And it says that if we measure this difference between mutual information from the left, then that implies that the unique information is larger than zero. And what does this practical criterion mean? How can we interpret it? I like thinking of the first term, the mutual information between v at time t and v at time t prime, as some type of autocorrelation. So how correlated is the macro with the future of the macro? And let's say you can predict 20% of the variance of the future of the macro from the past of the macro. Then the second term is the sum of the predictive power of each of the parts. So let's say we are trying to predict where the center of mass of the flock will be in the future. We try to do it from the first bird, you get 1%. The second bird, you get 2%. And you have 100 birds. So you sum up all the predictive power of each of the birds, and you see if that explains the predictive power that the flock has on itself. And if that do not explain, if the predictive power of the parts do not explain the predictive power of the whole, then you're in business. So that's the idea. That's the intuition. And so the important thing is that, as you can see, this is simple to compute in the sense that you are only considering two variables at a time, either the macro versus the macro, or a single micro versus the macro. So this is very low dimensional. It's only two dimensions, and if the system size grows with numbers, if n grows, the dimensions don't grow, and that is what makes it applicable to very large systems. So the second point, it avoids the course of dimensionality, which is a very good news, for big systems. And the third point is that it's computationally practical, because although it's not perfect, you could misdetect some cases. It doesn't give you false positives. So if that gives you a yes, it's a yes.
Yes. Two questions. One from the audience is asking, does theorem one imply that if you set up a system, either evolving it to be or somehow just setting it up from the start to be something with maximal synergy, that means it would inevitably be emergent?
It means that there is a coarse graining that will have unique information with respect to the parts. It doesn't tell you how to find that function, and maybe it will be hard to find, but it tells you it exists.
Nice. Yeah. That's a good point. And then my question was about the might misdetect. So what's a false negative look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you see the sum of the predictability of the parts, it might be the case that the predictive ability, maybe two birds are very correlated with each other. So maybe they are very good predictors, but maybe their predictive power is actually the same because they are very similar. You are not taking into account that, and then you are double counting their predictability in a way, because you're saying, oh, this predicts 5% and this other predicts 5%, but you didn't realize it was the same 5%. And because of that, the sum of the predictive power of the parts is usually overestimating the ability to predict the parts. And that's why it can be over-conservative. And that's why the criterion is easy to compute in big systems, but it becomes less and less sensitive, and that's a limitation. And one thing that we're working at the moment is how to trade off that thing and how to get it a bit more sensitive, because in practice, when you go to very, very large systems, you can calculate this, but it will never give you emergence because it becomes too insensitive because of double counting. So it's an important thing, but nevertheless, the fact that you can compute it is a very good news. Okay.
I'm going to ask one more cheeky question, which is that Is there a case where like you can do something like a two-step thing where you identify some important mesoscale
Huh.
first, and then based on that mesoscale you do something similar where you now look at you sum the interesting mesoscales to see if there's synergy?
That's a absolutely fantastic question. You could do it, but you are just doing it twice. We haven't worked out this framework in a way that you can do these two things in an integrated way. And my intuition says the whole should be more than the sum of the parts. So there should be a smart way to do this together instead of doing it in two stages. But that is something we haven't figured out yet.
Thank you. Nice.
Yeah. Excellent. So one example of how this can be applied, I hope you're familiar with something called the game of life from Conway. It's a set of automata that have these super simple rules that your state is a grid of zeros and ones, and you evolve it in time with some very simple rules about how which stay on and which stay off, which we don't need to specify, but the point is that the rule is very simple, and nevertheless it generates super fascinating behavior. So you can have particles sliding and colliding and generating other particles and stuff like that. So what we did here with the game of life was we built so the micro is the state of the cells, and then the macro is, given that we know the game of life, so we are all big geeks of the game of life, and we know some of the particles that are fun, so the blinkers, the gliders, etc. We build a filter that detects specific particles. So, and what we did was to make a sort of a particle collider. So the initial conditions that we set were particles, and we make them collide, and these collisions generate other particles. And that's one of the reasons why this thing is famous, because it sort of imitates a bit of particle physics. So then our question was, let's try to predict the outcome of a collision. And we were doing these collisions, and then we were seeing how much of the result of a collision is explained by each of the cells separately, and how much is explained by knowing which was the initial, the identity of the part of these sets of things in the beginning. And we found that even though there were a lot of cells, so we were double counting quite a bit, the explanatory power of knowing the identity of the initial configurations was not explained away by the predictive power of the single cells. So in this case, there was a case of emergence, in the sense that knowing that in the beginning you have two gliders colliding was telling you something about the future that couldn't be get from the individual cells. And this was sort of a validation example where we have this intuition that there is something emergent in the game of life, and this framework was capturing numerically. So then we also, yes?
There's another question, and I think it was on the previous slide, but I think it's good to do it in the case of the game of life, which is the question is like, how do we find the coarse grainings, or does it have to be known?
Yeah, that's at the moment the big question. So here we are finding it because we know the game of life, and if you have a brain, it's not very clear what are the gliders in the brain. So at the moment, that's a big bottleneck for the framework, and we are building. We are now building a couple of different directions in order to kind of have functions with parameters that you can train in order to find good f values. So you can learn a function that is emergent, actually, and this is something we're doing in different directions. But so far, if you don't use these training strategies, you have to rely on expert knowledge, basically. Okay, so I will continue unless you stop me with more questions. So there is this flocking model, the Reynolds flocking model, and we have three cases. There is an avoidance parameter on how much the birds try to group themselves as military birds on the left or crazy birds on the right, and we have something in between. And the red dot is the center of mass. And here the question is the red dot having something to say about itself that is not found from the other birds? And the long story short, if for the military birds, there is each bird it knows what the center of mass is going to do, because they are all like an army, so there is nothing to be seen there. In the crazy birds, each bird has no idea what is going to happen, and the center of mass has no idea what is going to happen, so nobody has any idea about anything, so nothing interesting. And the middle case, there is emergence. So in the middle case, the birds are noisy enough so they don't have an idea what is happening collectively, but the center of mass is more consistent, so it has some idea about itself. And there is this balance where the magic happens. And in the interest of time, so I have some examples from applications to the brain, and maybe I will skip them, and maybe if somebody's interested, we can review them later. The only thing I want to highlight from here is that, related with the question from before, in the case of the human brain, this is fMRI data. We had no idea what the coarse graining was going to be. But what we did was to measure synergy directly. And there are ways to measure synergy. And because we have this theorem that synergy implies emergence, we can say something about emergence just by measuring synergy. The downside of that approach is powerful because you don't need to specify the feature. The downside is that you cannot measure synergy in very big systems because it's computationally very hard. So what we did in this example was to study all the synergies in pairs of time series. So there is 100 time series, and we study all the pairs, all the time series in groups of 2, and then computed the synergy for each of them, and then study the synergy network, which is not the ideal solution, but because we are considering synergies of order 2 and not order 3, 4, 5, 700. But it gives us a first approach to deal with this problem. But this would be much more powerful if we would have an idea of what is the F, or if we would have some automated algorithm to train and find the right F. And again, if somebody wants to know more about this, let me know. I will just skip it. And we'll go to the second part, because I find the second part there's going to be a lot of interesting ideas for us to discuss too. So I hope with that discussion, you have some idea of one approach to quantify emergence based on this unique information of macro features about the future. And this is all related with information decomposition and synergy and stuff like that. Now we're going to try a completely different approach based on something that I would call computational closure. So this starts from this trying to step back and think about software. And the intuition would be emergence has something to do with how software works in computers. So let's say you're programming in Python or whatever your favorite language, and you are having this super simple algorithm. You assign a value for A, another value for B. You calculate C equal A plus B, and you run the thing and you get 5. The interesting thing of that is that every time you run the algorithm, you get the same outcome. So we could say the macro level is A, B, and C and their dynamics. The micro level is the physics of your computer. And every time you run the algorithm, and also there is a coarse graining that from the physical configuration of your computer at each time point, the X, that would be a super big vector with the position of all the particles of the computer, etc. There's a coarse graining that tells you this computer is representing A equal 3 and this B equal whatever. So an interesting thing to note is that every time you run your algorithm in Python, you will get the same result for C, but every time you run it, the physics that are underlying this computation are different. So the sequence of C are the same every time you run it, but the realization of the X's might be completely different. Maybe the first run the spins were like this, the second run the spins were like that. So there is an invariance in the macro level dynamics that are shielded from what is going on at the micro level, and that seemed to be intrinsic to what software is. And this is not only for computers, this is happening all the time. Like in the beginning, you might find it, oh, this must be very special, but actually this happens everywhere. Like, for example, let me give you an example that I find very amusing. How the toilet flushing system works. So when you flush the toilet, there is a water going out, and then there is water coming in, and then the level of the water start going up. And there is a floating device, and when the water is high enough, it will push the floating device to a point that we will close the water input, and then the water will stay. And that could be described as a for loop or as a while loop in computer science, right? So while the level is low, don't do anything, and when the condition failed, then you change it. So as you can see, at the micro level, there is a whole complicated physical system with a lot of momentum and molecules of water and whatnot. But at the macro level, there is a very simple logic flow of events that happen. And there is a decoupling, because for the thing to close the loop, it doesn't matter the position of the particle n or a lot of microscopic instantiation. So my claim is that the toilet is implementing some type of software. And although we don't take to think like that, but I think that's really the case. Let me put another example, the one below. Let's say we have a self-driving car, and the self-driving car is approaching an object and it has to turn left and then turn right. So the car is a very complicated system composed of trillions of particles, but the self-driving system is not operating on the information of each of the particles. It's operating on very few variables. That is the vision and few indications, but the dimensions are certainly not the same as the microscopic constituents of the car. And nevertheless, it managed to avoid the obstacle and drive in a very civilized way. So that system also operates effectively at a level set that is completely shielded from the microscopic details. So this emergence of closed logics are happening all the time and is very important for everything around us. So I will define information closure as systems where this happens. So that is you want to predict what will happen at the level of the macro. You make a prediction from what happened before the macro. And information closure means that there is nothing else to be gained by seeing below the macro. So let's say you have the option to pay money to see how the macro is being instantiated in terms of microscopic details. And if that money is not worth it because you're not going to gain anything useful, everything useful was already contained in the coarse grain representation given by the macro, then you are in the situation of information closure. And those formulas are the same idea, but represented in terms of information theory quantities. Now, causal closure is something slightly different. The previous thing is about predictions. Causality is about interventions. And the idea is causal closure will be a system that everything that makes a difference in terms of macro things are interventions that can be done at the macro level. So macro interventions are all that can make a difference for the macro. So there is nothing extra that you could change in the macro that you could do in the micro, but you couldn't do in the macro. So I hope you can see the similarities, but the key difference is that there is a intervention here making a difference. So how can we formalize causal closure? And here we turn into something called computational mechanics, which I don't know if you're familiar, but let me explain you very, very quickly. The idea, the core principle that we're going to use is something called the epsilon machine. So the epsilon machine, the idea is that you have a time series, like a sequence of zeros and ones, for example, and you fix a given time point, and you ask, from that time point on, I want to consider past sequences of events, and I will check their predictive ability to what will happen after them. So for example, you have this X sequence of X's from very far away until the time T, and you wonder what are their predictions for what will happen after. And if two sequences are different, but they have the same forecasting ability, so they predict exactly the same, they don't make any different predictions in order to any of the possible events, they give the same weights, the same likelihoods. Then you group them together and you say, in my opinion, those things are the same because they give me the same information, basically. They give you the same predictions. So you coarse grain, as in the yellow boxes, you put together states, trajectories that give you the same predictions, and you only distinguish trajectories that give you different predictions. So that gives you coarse grain states that are called causal states, because those are the states that lead to differences. And then you consider what are the dynamics between those coarse grain states, and those are given by this matrix T, and you can prove that the dynamics are going to be Markovian. So at the end, this construction gives you something similar to a Hayden-Markov model. So in the hidden Markov model, you have dynamics between causal states that are jumping between causal states, and each causal state is generating some observations that are the actual variables that you are measuring. So in principle, the core intuition is that you are trying to identify the computational mechanisms that is really what is going on in your system. So you have some data and you see what are the computations that are happening behind the scenes. So it is machine jumping between states. And because of those jumps, they generate data that is what you observe. So you're basically reverse engineering your data to generate the simplest machine that could have generating the data that you're observing. So we started from this idea of epsilon machines, and then we thought, well, what happens if we have a macro, a coarse-graining? So in that case, we will have a sequence of x's, and we'll have an epsilon machine at the level of the x's, that is the e sub t below. Then when we coarse-grain, we have a sequence of sets, and then we have a lot of sets predicting set, and then you can coarse-grain different sets, and then you have the causal states at the level of the macro, and then you have another epsilon machine that is e prime. But you could do a funny diagonal here, that is, to what extent different past sequences of the micro predict the macro. And this is something we call the upsilon machine, because it's going up. And the idea here is that we coarse-grain different past trajectories of the micro to the degree they give the same predictions for what will happen in the macro. And we can think of this as interventions. So these are the types of interventions that will give different outcomes. So now we have when we see what makes a difference for set, we can see this at two scales. One is what makes a difference for set in terms of past events of set, and those are the causal states in E prime, and those are different interventions that we can do at the macro level, And then we can ask for micro interventions that can make a difference for the macro, and that would be U. So in general, the mathematics of this is complicated, but in general, we can think intuitively that the E sub t, the epsilon of the bottom, is the types of interventions that make any difference. It is difference that you can see at the level of the micro. Then E prime are macro interventions that make any difference for the macro. And the U sub t is this intermediate thing where it's like interventions at the micro that make a difference for the macro. And with these three machines, we defined causal closure as situations where the epsilon machine of the macro, so E prime, is equal to the upsilon machine, so U sub t. And that means in human language, when the micro interventions that make a difference for the macro are the same as the macro interventions that make the difference for the macro. And that means there is no micro interventions that make a difference for the macro that could not be instantiated as macro interventions. I hope that gives some intuition of what is going on. So it's all about classifying interventions, and if there is no intervention that would make a difference that you would need to go one level below to make it, then you are in a causally closed system. So with all that in place, we've proved one first theorem that was to say that in many situations, the information closure and causal closure are equivalent. And the big caveat of this theorem is that this is valid for fully observed systems. So you are observing all the variables that are relevant, there is no confounding. So if there is no confounding, if you're measuring everything that should be measured, causal closure and information closure are equivalent. This is the first result. Then, going to computational closure, that is the most interesting part. As I was saying before, epsilon machines are this idea of trying to carve natural computational joints. So we have these patterns, and we find the minimal computational model that could generate those patterns. And that generates the description in the top. The interesting thing is that these epsilon machines, this hidden Markov model version of the epsilon machines, are formally equivalent to an automata description of the same thing. So you can think of this machine that is generating the observed patterns as, instead, you can think of it as an automata where you input strings of stuff and it does some transitions. And that is a very different type of, that's a more computational system. So the HMMs are, hidden macro models are more of a dynamical description, but the automata, finite automata are used in in theoretical computer science as the simplest type of computational devices. And the idea in computer science is that you have this system that you add inputs and you drive transitions, and then you see where the system ends with a given string. And with that, you can reject or accept strings, and that's the basics for answering queries and stuff like that. So I will not get, we can, if you have questions, you can ask me later. But this duality between seeing the epsilon machine as a HMM, as a hidden macro process, as a hidden process in a hidden space, versus seeing it as an automata where you drive it on transitions and the transitions inform you where you are, and depending on the string of inputs, that's the whole key to see the same description as a dynamical process or as a computational process. Now, the key intuition of computational closure is that, let's say we have this system that, let's say we have a system with the causal states are the small circles, the small yellow circles. And every input you add, you are driving transitions between the small circuit. And you go between all the small circles and between all of these dynamics. A natural question would be, what if we coarse grain the states, the causal states? So instead of having the small yellow circles, we will have the bigger light yellow circles. That sort of gives you also transitions, right? Because you're transiting between this to there, or staying the same. But a key thing of the automata in computer science is that the transitions are deterministic. So if you are in a yellow thing and you input the thing, you go to the other place and not other one. So you have to know where you're going when you give the input. And the problem is that if you are in the big circle, you don't know in which of the small circles you are. And then if I give the input, I will not be sure what is the next destination. So the dynamics stop being deterministic and start being in general stochastic. So, and that doesn't work because that doesn't give you an automata, it gives you something else. So the question is, when can you coarse grain your inputs also? So here, every small circle has 3 arrows going out. That means that you're giving three inputs. And we can see that the big circles usually have 2 options. Either they move to the next or they stay. So can we coarse grain the inputs from 3 to 2 in order to keep having deterministic dynamics? And if it's possible, if there exists a coarse graining of inputs that give you that property, that recovers deterministic dynamics between those coarse grained states, then this is computational closure. And the idea would be that there is the computational process of jumping between states with the inputs can be thought as happening at multiple stages, where the bigger, more simple part of the computation is happening between these big circles that are jumping in a simpler way given by the simpler version of the inputs, and then the smaller details are happening in the transition between the smaller states. So, and in summary, the idea a system is computationally closed when you can coarse grain the states and coarse grain the inputs, and you get another automata, and then you can think of the computations as happening at multi levels. Great. So in general, computational closure can be thought like this. So you have a microscopic system with microscopic statistics, you build the epsilon machine. Then you go to a mesoscopic level, you have different statistics, you have a different epsilon machine, and then you go to macro level. So you can do this multiple times. You build epsilon machines for each of them. And computational closure will happen if the epsilon machines happen to be related to each other by coarse grainings also. So in other words, if the system is computationally closed, you can obtain the epsilon machine that explains the mesoscopic level and the macroscopic level as coarse grainings of the microscopic epsilon machine. And this is sort of reminiscent of something called renormalization theory in physics, where you have a microscopic theory that explains the dynamics, and then you play with the theory to get an effective theory that explains the macroscopic dynamics, and then you can play again with the theory to get the simpler theory for the macro level. And if all these theories are compatible, that means you are computationally close. And something that might not be so trivial is that this doesn't happen always, and actually this is the exception and not the rule. So if you take whatever coarse graining in whatever system, usually the epsilon machines are not compatible. They are related in very strange ways. They're not the coarse graining of each other, and you can have all sort of funny things. So this is a very special property, and when you have it, then the system is computationally closed. And we can prove theorems about lattice diagrams that commute. So if you coarse grain and then you take the epsilon machine, it's the same as you first take the epsilon machine and then you coarse grain and stuff like that, that we can discuss more later. I'm running out of time. So this is how the thing looks like in like the broader picture. So for example, in this case, we have a system with 5 states. So it's a microsystem with only 5 states, and you have dynamics on that system. And that is described in the left by the slowest circle with all the dots separately. So then you can coarse grain 2 of them, and then you get a state with 4 states, and you have all the coarse grainings that you are meshing together 2, and you get 4 with the purple color. And then you can mesh together 3, and you get 2 things. No, you mesh things in a way that you get 3 things out, and those you have the oranges. You can smash them in a way that you get 2, and you get the green ones, and you can smash everything together. You get the top red. So at the left, we have all the possible coarse grainings of a system with 4 states. Some of those coarse grainings are going to be causally close. So their epsilon machine has these fancy properties, and we can take only those coarse grainings. And one theorem we proved is that this also is a lattice, and it's a smaller lattice than the crazy lattice of all coarse graining that grows very quickly. So now we have a lattice of causally closed processes. And now if we calculate the epsilon machine for each of them, we can prove that they are going to be all computationally closed, and they're all going to be nicely arranged in an even simpler lattice. And the main point is that if what the theory is trying to propose is that if you want to understand how the computations of this system, the whole system, are happening, the lattice of epsilon machines is the right tool for you, because this is going to tell you how the computation happening at different scales are looking, and how the coarse grainings are related, and you can see what is happening at what level. So for example, all the time, the trivial coarse graining, that is the constant, so any state goes to 0, that is always on top, and that always have this single state epsilon machine that recurs to itself. So that is not doing anything. And below, you start having more complicated things. In this case, you have something with 2 states that sometimes switch and sometimes they stay. And below, you have more complicated things. And also another interesting property is that things are not always aligned in a single line. This is a lattice, so there's always a supremum that is the simplest, and a minimum that is the epsilon machine of the whole micro. And in between, you can have branchings and then coming together and things like that. And useful things that can happen. For example, this is the simplest case where you have a given microscale X, you have a one computationally closed system set, and then you have the trivial coarse graining that tells everything to 1 at the top. So the lattice of in causally closed systems always look the same. So you have X, you have the coarse graining set, you have the coarse graining 1. Now the lattice of epsilon machines might be different. And what are the options? So in case 1, in the panel A, that's the standard case where the computation happening at set is not trivial. So it's different from the computation happening at 1, that is a single state recurring to itself. It's not the same as the computation happening at the micro. So the lattice of epsilon machines is isomorphic to the lattice of coarse graining. Case B, we have the computations in set are not trivial, but are the same that are happening in X. So when you move from X to set, you are sort of not getting a new computation. A simpler computation is the same, and in a way, set is just a better encoding of X. So the computation are the same, but it's just simpler when you see it in real space. The theories that explain them are the same. Now, if you go to the case C, that is the case where set is computationally closed, but the epsilon machine is trivial. And that might not be super evident. For example, if you have a system, the X, with some interesting dynamics, and you coarse grain it, you get set, and set is IID, is independent but identically distributed and independent. That is sort of a noisy process. So there is no correlation between itself. So the thing is going to look different at each time point, but there is no dynamics, there is no prediction, there is no causality. And that means that computationally the thing is doing nothing, even though if the variable is going up and down. And you can see that only when you build the epsilon machine and you realize there is a single epsilon machine that is recurring to itself. And that means computationally is the same as the thing. And you have this lattice of epsilon machines that is not the same as the lattice of coarse grainings. And then the final case is the micro was actually noise, pure noise. So it was not computing anything. And then all the things collapse into the same epsilon machine. So this is just a very simple toy kind of analysis of different situations that you can have when you have a single causally closed system. And the point made by this slide is how much more information you can gain when you study the systems, not from the direct representation of how you see them, but from their computational versions that are given by the epsilon machines. Good. So now some examples. The first example, we're going to consider some zero automata. So in the case of zero automata, we're going to consider two rules. I hope you know zero automata. So we start with some binary state in the top, and then we start evolving the zero automata from top to bottom. And every step you apply this filter that is given there by 3 inputs, you get an output. So the next guy below, you calculate the 3 above, and then the one below is the computation of the 3 above following this rule. And this rule number 19, is the XOR of the guy on top of you and the guy to the right, for example. No, the rule 90, I think, is the one symmetric. Yeah, then there might be a typo, but I think it's symmetric. So it's a simple XOR of two things, and the left and the right XOR, and that gives you the one below. And the important thing of rule 90 is that you can prove that the coarse set here, the macro variable, so the micro variable is the state of every agent, which is a binary vector of size n. And you start evolving this, so that's a microdynamics. Set is going to be the parity of the whole thing. So it's an even parity. So if you sum all the active cells, do you get an even number or an odd number? And you can prove that with rule 90, all the configurations are always with even parity. So the parity is a conserved quantity. And that means that set is always 0 all the time. And that means that it's informationally closed, but it's a trivially one because it's equal to the constant. So the computation is one state going to itself. If we change the rule a little bit, and now instead of having a simple XOR of 2 inputs, we have the XOR of the 3 parents, then we have a case that is an epsilon more interesting. So in this case, you can prove that the parity is conserved. So you initialize the initial condition randomly. It has some parity, and then the next parity is going to be the same as the one before. But if the initial condition had odd parity, it will stay odd. If it was an even parity, it will stay even. And that means that the epsilon machine of the parity now has 2 states, and each of them recur to itself. So the computation is not terribly exciting, but slightly more complicated than the computation done by the conserved quantity in the previous case. So all this to say that conserved quantities are computationally closed. Their computations are not super exciting, but they can be trivial, like this diagram in the bottom, where the one and the set collapse, or they can be non-trivial because you have different states that stay on themselves. And yeah. Now I'm running out of time, so I will skip this. If anyone is interested about the statistical mechanics, we have the Ehrenfest diffusion model that is computationally closed. We have the Ising model that is computationally closed. So if people want to discuss this, let me know in the discussion. Let me discuss this example that I find helpful. Here we have a graph. Let's look the graph in the bottom. So you have a graph with a lot of nodes in colors, and they are arranged in a community structure. So they are strongly coupled within communities, and the communities are the 5 different colors, and they're weakly coupled between communities. And the dynamics are a random walk in this graph in the bottom. So you have a person that is in one node, and then randomly with probability Q goes to another node. And when it needs to decide where to go, it will go with a probability proportional to the strength of the links. So it's most likely to stay in the same community, going to another node of the same community. And with less probability, it will jump to another member of another community. And long story short, you can prove that if set is the identity of the community where you are, that variable, that process, the process of I'm being in community A, and after a while I move to community E, and then I go to community C, that process is computationally closed. And the interesting thing in this example is that there is another computationally closed on top of this level, that is to say, not in which community you are, but how big the community is. So for example, in this case, we have two sizes. We have communities of size 9 that are the orange, the blue, and the green. And we have communities of size 25 that are the red and the pink. So if you are, and now we have in a dynamic, a simpler dynamic in two states only. So I'm in communities of size 25, and suddenly I move to a community of size 9, and then, so you have this simpler dynamic in between these two states, and you can prove that that is also computationally closed from the level below. So in this case, we could argue that this system, microsystem, is all the computations related to the dynamic are done in a two-step process. You select in what is the size of your community, and then you select which of the community, and then you select where in that community you are. And each of the processes are nested computationally, so they are. And one important point is that, for example, if you want to simulate the dynamics at the macro level, you don't need to simulate the levels, the details below, and the dynamics are going to be perfect. So you will not miss anything. And the same with the mesoscopic level. And the last example, and with this I'm finishing. I don't know if you're familiar with something called the Hopfield networks. So Hopfield networks are recurrent neural networks that are used for study memory consolidation and retrieval. And you have an activation function that is related in the states of all the other networks in pretty standard way of neural networks. And there is a way where you encode patterns on the weights. So there is a way that is not very complicated. If you have M patterns that you want to remember, you create weights with a specific functional form shown there. And you can show that if you initialize the system randomly, the dynamics are going to have basins of we have attractors, and the attractors are the patterns that you remember if you do this correctly. And it will to have basins of attractions, and that means that if you start with a noisy version of one pattern, you're going to move to the pattern that is closest to you instead of going to the others. And one very helpful way to visualize that dynamic is by computing the dot product of the current state against the different patterns. And that tells you sort of a notion of similarity on how different or how similar my current state is with respect to the different patterns. So for example, in this case, we have a state of a number of neurons, and we have something that is like a noisy 2. And the system is supposed to memorize these 5 digits, and we can compute 5 dot products, and the idea is that the dot product that is the similarity with 2 is going to be much bigger than the dot products related with the other 4. And you can prove that the dot products are going to go either to 1 or to 0, and then you can explain the dynamics. So what we did, the intuition we had was that maybe the computations happening at the level in the Hopfield network, the dynamics happening at the level of the dot products are computationally closed. Because what matters for where you're going to end don't depend on the micro level, as only depends on the proximity you have from your current state to your possible destinations. And that's what we found, basically. So if you do the math, you can prove that the dynamics of the set, the vector set here, the set is a vector, is computationally closed with respect to the states of the individual neurons. And with that, I'm almost done. So let me just summarize a little bit everything that I have been speaking about. So I will just make 3 points. The first is that I hope I convinced you a little bit maybe that having quantitative tools about emergence is helpful to frame conjectures that are very precise and then to test them. So one thing with emergence is that we can say, oh, this is emergent or this other thing is emergent, but if we don't really say exactly what do we mean with that, then it's very difficult to move forward. So the argument is that having mathematics of this, having equations that are instantiating emergence in different ways, we can have very rigorous conjectures. So when we say the brain is emergent or this neural network is emergent, we know exactly what are we conjecturing about, and then we can test that conjecture on data and decide in an objective manner and not in a persuasive manner. And there are some people that emergence is sort of a fancy word, and a lot of people like talking about emergence when they actually mean spontaneous collective behavior. And one of my hopes with this is to try to make emergence more specific. So to say this is emergent and this is just collective behavior. So not everything collective is emergent. And I think what we're trying to do at the moment is to try to characterize precisely the types of emergent behavior that we think is more interesting and to characterize it properly and to understand how all of them relate to each other. Then we saw one way of calculating emergence related to unique information. One thing that I didn't stress enough, well, I did implicitly, is that all the definition of unique information is with respect to parts and wholes. So that approach to emergence based on synergy and unique information and all that is very useful when you have a macro system that is composed by parts. So you have a flock of birds or you have things like that. Because as you notice, the last part of the computational part of the talk, there was nothing about parts. It's only micro and macro, but no parts. So this is an interesting feature of that approach, of the information decomposition approach, that there's a very strong focus on the parts structure of the system. And then the whole game is how the parts are related with the whole thing together. And the composition in parts is crucial. So for when that type of decomposition is of interest, then this type of approaches are most likely very helpful. And then in the last part of the talk, I introduced this idea of thinking emergence in terms of computations. So we defined what is computational closure and then how to think of multi-scale systems that are computing at each scale and how we can relate the computation happening at different scales to each other. So why computational closure is interesting? I think there are two ways to see that question. One is intrinsic, so for the system itself. So if a system has computational closure sublevels, like macro levels that are computationally closed, that means that there are some layers of yourself that are controllable. So there is an efficient way to control them because you can steer it only with macroscopic interventions. Usually microscopic interventions are pretty hard. And if you have a level of yourself that you can control macroscopically, that's usually a good news. And my suspicion is that that is very important for living organisms, because if you would need to control yourself at the level of atoms, we will all be not alive. So, but that is something that still is on the, there's a lot to do there to cash out exactly what you can get out of this type of things. So that is from the intrinsic perspective. From the researcher perspective, there is another viewpoint to this, that is, if a system has causal closure and computational closure, you can simulate its behavior optimally without taking into account the level below. And that can be super helpful because there might be simulations that are completely impossible, but maybe you don't need them. And it's not an approximation that is still useful, it's perfect. It's just perfect. You restrict to the level you want, you run the thing, and you just forget everything that is below. So from a computational perspective for simulating, that's also pretty helpful. And with that, I think I'm done. Yes, so that's all for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward for the discussion.
Amazing. Yeah, well, thank you so much. This was really, really great. We've already got one question from the audience. Feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. I'll start off with Matthias' question. Have these methods already allowed us to discover some new or unknown cases of emergence? Do these definitions have some counterintuitive applications, such as phenomena that we wouldn't have naively considered emergent, but are according to your definitions, or vice versa?
That's a fantastic question. I think we are not there yet. So usually the timeline is that you propose something, you validate it on cases that you take for granted that if it's not emergent, your thing is wrong. So that's usually the first step of calibration. I would describe it like that. And then the second step is to go to places where you think the thing is emergent and you try to see what can you get out of that. And that is basically what we're doing now with neuroscience. And I would say the third step would be to go to places where you think things are not emergent and maybe be surprised. And I don't think we have done that, but that's a very interesting point. And yeah, I think that will happen, but I don't think we're there yet.
Cool. I have a couple questions. One question is on so when you were describing the software case, you're talking about how there's many, many arrangements of the molecules in a toilet or the spins in a computer drive, which will lead to the same software. And I noticed that in both those cases, there's a sense in which this whole thing only holds when the microsystem is in some like viability region. So like there are states that you could put the hardware in each of those cases in which the software no longer holds.
Hmm.
So I'm curious if like in all of the like simple or mathematical examples you gave, the kind of viability region was the whole system. This seems to hold in no matter what the variables are. But it seems like in real systems there's something else going on, which is like um there's only this only holds when your microdynamics are within some kind of viability region.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. So in neuroscience, a lot of people, for example, John Krakauer and others, they used to say that uh, you can study the brain at a certain level when things are fine. But when things break down, usually you have to go below.
Hmm.
And I think that's saying what you're saying in a different way. So the degrees of closure might depend very strongly on the regime in which the system is working, and it's very likely to conjecture that when things are going wrong, that thing is being broken. Like another example is software in the computer. Like you don't need to understand what is going on until things start breaking, and then usually we don't know well enough, so you have to call the technician to fix it.
Mm.
But that calling the technician means that you have to go to the level below to do something that you don't need to do in normal life.
Yeah.
So I think your intuition is correct. That's a really nice point.
And so to continue on that a little bit, I guess one thing that we're often interested in, like when thinking about how AI systems could go wrong, is the edge cases, which are normally characterized by like side channel attacks. So uh in like a computer security setting, a side channel attack is where a hacker exploits some hardware vulnerability to mess up the software. So you have software which is like provably safe when it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, and then a adversary might do something like um yeah work with the power information from the power consumption of the thing, or they might work with like intentionally modifying the RAM in such a way to like produce magnetic fields which breaks the security which breaks the like hardware software link. And what's interesting there is that like in these cases of side channels, it's not like you're completely breaking the system. It's kind of like there is some leakage or some kind of like approximate sense. It's like within some viability region, you can make understand it's closed, but then like on the edge of the region, you suddenly start understanding there's like you can quotient out by your coarse graining and you can still understand some interesting micro level dynamics.
Hmm.
Um, does this link to anything that you've thought about with this framework yet?
Yeah, very, very much so. So there are two angles of this. One is that all the tools I described, they in one way or another assume stationarity. So in order to calculate anything. So epsilon machines, you need the stationarity. Um, all the other information theoretic approaches, they don't assume it in theory, but in practice to compute them, you do assume it. So to go beyond stationarity is tricky. It is definitely something that we are really interested. And the hope in the long run would be to have a dynamic account of emergence. And then you can say at that point,
Mm,
something emerged. It's not that the system is displaying something emergent on the stationary condition. It's like at that moment, something happened. Again, we are not there, but I think that should. There are different ways that you could think about that. There are a lot of point-wise information theory approaches where you calculate some type of probability distribution and then you evaluate it in different specific time points and you can look for outliers or different things. So there are different ways about it. It's not easy at all.
mhm,
So that's why we haven't done it, but I think it's possible. So that's a super interesting avenue for future work. Um, the other point that was you made me think about is that currently the theory is about perfectly closure. Everything is zero, like information closure is you have everything. It's most likely that, especially I think in nature, like nothing is perfect in nature. Like there are going to be leakages of things everywhere. And we are thinking of extensions, and we have already a little bit of work on that, like how to deal with when you have an epsilon of information closure,
mm,
like how to deal with that in a principled way. And we have already some ideas based on information geometry that you have some manifolds, and when the manifolds are close enough, etc. So I and so that is going to be. I feel it's important in one hand to have a theory about that. So it's not only information like measurement error, and we don't have enough data. Like to have that into the theory, I think is important. And then I also think that is going to be very helpful in practice.
yeah,
To because another thing related is that imagine you have data and you feed an epsilon machine, and the perfect epsilon machine is completely insanely large.
mhm,
But if you allow a little not perfection, like a little error, then it's simplified like crazy.
mhm, mhm,
Then I would vote for go to a simpler one. It
yeah,
doesn't, so there should be a principal way to trade off the accuracy versus the complication of the epsilon machine, and that is also related with all this.
yeah, yeah,
And all those are developments are in different stages, but we are we're working on all that.
yeah, yeah. I'm gonna like just repeat this maybe for the audience's sake in for the video, but I think the interesting point on the last thing is also something around like when you have this slight imperfection, it'll be interesting to have machinery that can tell us like exactly like what the kind of error is. So something like you have a coarse graining, but you also have something which points at like, and this is like the theoretical thing that might also be useful in practice. This is like idea that you have a coarse graining, it tells you almost everything, but then you also have some systematic way of telling you what you don't know. That,
Yeah.
and that gives you an indication of where to look when things start breaking. We have another question from the audience here, which is more practical. How useful do you think this framework will be to find emergent or interesting macroscopic variables in neural networks or LLM, either during inference or during training?
Yeah, my hope is that this is going to be super helpful. There is a lot of uh, this is something you could do today, but I feel that there is a number of theoretical things that need to happen before you can do it properly.
Hmm.
One of the things obvious to deal with is scaling. Because if you want to compute something on a system with trillions of parameters, then you have to do something about dimensionality. But I am very hopeful that that is possible and that that is going to open avenues. So another way to frame my general thoughts on this, um, there has been forever ideas about collective intelligence and like we are more smart together and things like that. But I have never seen a fundamental theory of how that works. And my hope is that this is sort of slowly laying the work for that to happen. I don't think this theory has solved that, but I think it's going in that direction. And I tend to think of neural networks like that. Like you have the neurons that are pretty silly, but together they're really smart. And how is that happening? And I believe this is slowly opening the possibility of having a rigorous theory to study that. And I'm very excited about that possibility.
That is very exciting. One last question from the audience, although feel free to keep typing, audience members, in case there's more. Yeah, it's about the commutative diagram that you kind of quickly went over, which is something like, have you like looked at this on one level of abstraction higher, like maybe even using like category theory or something, with the idea being that you can understand, yeah, like what the structure of this kind of commutative relation is. My guess is to why this is interesting is something like when you're thinking about the like more approximate cases, you might be talking about how the commutation here breaks, and you might have a principled way of talking about what like the commutator or something of this kind of situation is.
Yeah, that's super exciting. The short answer is no, we haven't looked at that. One of the reasons is that I have never gotten into category theory as I should, and the main reason for that is that I have never had the motivation for doing it. Like
Hmm.
everybody says it's amazing, but every time I ask, like, okay, what can I do with that I cannot do today? I'm never excited enough to get into there.
Hmm.
But this could be the reason, and I would love that. So it makes sense to me what you say. Like this is the standard object that category theory seems to work with, and if that is something that could be done, I would be very curious to hear more about it.
Amazing. Yeah, we have another question. I think this was addressed a little bit during the talk in the middle. Maybe it'd be interesting to hear some more thoughts on it, which is something like um the information decomposition framing. We talked about the individuals, this like lower bound in terms of summing up all of the individuals. And you mentioned how like sometimes that we get false positives from this. Sorry, false negatives from it. Um,
Mm.
and yeah, the question was similar to one I asked about there being like intermediate levels, but I think I'm curious if you have more thoughts on the thing you were saying about there being like
Let me ask to see if I go in the right direction. So there is something that some people ask with all fairness. That is to say, this criterion is a bit too easy because
mhm,
you are considering the parts in isolation and you're not even considering the links between two parts.
yeah.
So instead of considering parts in isolation, you could want to consider at least groups of two parts at the same time.
Hmm.
And the answer is that the theory, the paper has, uh, this is the simpler version of the criterion. The full theory has different degrees of emergence. So this would be emergence at level 1. That means you are emergent with respect to the single parts. But then you can be emergent at level 2, that is emergent with respect to dyads. Emergence at level 3 with triads, and then 4, 5, 6 until to n minus 1.
Hmm.
And being emergent at level n minus 1 is the hardest thing to do because you can also prove if you are emergent at level k, you are emergent to all the levels below.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's harder, it becomes harder and harder. And from a practical point of view, the problem is that the double counting becomes worse and worse. So the sensitivity of the criterion decreases when you try more difficult things. So and also the estimation of the mutual information terms is going to become worse because you have to estimate higher dimensional marginals.
Hmm.
So this is in theory done and sorted. In practice, absolutely no. Like we don't have a practical way to really scale this up and study it properly. I would love to see, for example, you could have a flock of birds and you could tell me what is the level at which the flock is stopping Emergent, and I would really like to see that. That would
Mm,
be super interesting. But that is something that computationally we haven't sorted out. We have some ideas, but we are still not there.
mhm. Nice, nice, sweet. I have one more like question on musing, which is, um, I think it'll be useful for the diagram with the five state thing with the three level, like the three different descriptions. Uh,
The network
yes. Wait, you missed it. No, no,
is
back. Sorry, with the you had like yeah, there's another one with five and three, I realized. The one
which
with
file
I think it's like 4 or 5 slides back. So
is
one back. Yes, this one. No,
uh,
yeah. Um, so one thing that I've kind of was thinking, I mean, this is like the case with all of these things, but this lattice, this has like um the most macro scale and the most micro scale are like single points. And I think, and you mentioned a little bit how this relates to renormalization. And one thing that's interesting to me in at least some more contemporary theories of renormalization and effective field theories in physics at the moment is that um, there's some kind of treatment which it's still difficult to like philosophically interpret, but I guess my interpretation of it is something like it's coarse grainings all the way down. So the idea is that there is no microscale, which you cannot assume that there's some smallest microscale on which things are like actually happening. Instead, any microscale is some kind of description which coarse grains a system below it which we do not understand. And so in all of your examples here, and I mean this is like first of all like this philosophical point in physics where it's like it seems like our best theories in physics at the moment have this weird shape where they kind of have to assume like there's some um coarse graining of a system below that they don't understand. And they actually, rather than looking at good coarse grainings with respect to a well-defined microscale, they almost like look at like they assume the microscale has this property of being like the fixed point of some coarse graining process, where it's like regardless of how often you coarse grain or you like at least at smaller scales kind of get the same shape theory with different parameters. And this kind of suggests that like on some level there isn't a most fundamental thing going on. Even if you assume there is, with any real system we look at, the smallest scale that we can access is never going to be the smallest scale that we postulate in theory. So in either case, there's this weird setting where it doesn't seem like the finest, like there is such thing as a fine grain thing on the smaller scale. And I think this relates to, in general, like people in computational mechanics often kind of like try and disavow this notion of causality at all, because part of what they're saying is like the epsilon machine isn't what's going on the real level. The epsilon machine is our best reconstruction of going on given some data. And this is even true for the most micro level description of a system, where all we can do is have some data and then have our best guess of what's going on. So I guess this is like in both cases, I'm trying to point to this like maybe more radically pragmatist or epistemic position where we never posit something about what's happening in the world. We all we can do is posit about the relations between different descriptions we have. And I think in the case that you're talking, this kind of might give us like a slightly different picture where we our lattice doesn't have a minimal element, and we never talk about there being some dynamics on which we do a course training on, but we only talk about the relation between different levels. I'm wondering if you thought about that, or if that would have any implications for the theory that you've.
Yeah, no, I have a few thoughts. First, super, I really like all this. Um, where should I start? So yeah, the first point is that all these theories related with the micro is all with respect to the micro level that you're given. So
Yes.
as you say, you're never saying anything absolute. It's all like how the coarse grains relate with micro, and if you change the micro to a smaller micro, things are going to change.
Hmm.
So that is all micro dependent in that sense. One thing that from what you were saying sounds really interesting is that what happens if you cannot see the micro,
Hmm.
you can only see different macros, and could you let you reconstruct some aspects of the micro that you are not seeing?
Hmm.
that could be a very interesting perspective. So you don't have the full diagram as given. You can only see parts of the diagram, and maybe that could let you reconstruct some parts that are missing. That would be pretty cool.
My guess there is
But
that thing that you can reconstruct would have like no longer a single possibility for the most micro scale.
yeah, but maybe you can still find some invariances that need to
Yeah,
be fulfilled or
yeah, I
something.
like that. Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, what you say about the strong epistemic stance, I have very mixed feelings about that, and it's very funny because if I'm in a room with where everybody is very strong about ontology and say this is how things are, I will take the epistemic hat and say no, 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 you cannot say anything. But if I'm in a room where everyone is epistemic and it's like no, there's all models, I usually take the ontological hat and start being a bit annoyed about that because I feel this is too easy to say it's all models, we have no idea what is going on. Because at the end of the day, some theories are empirically more effective, and that means that there is something that we are grasping. So I feel that both stances, when they're taken too strongly, is too easy in a way, and that we are somewhere in between. And and this is a discussion I have very constantly, very regularly about the emergent stuff, because it would be easier to say all this emergence is a way of talking, and we are not sure what is really going on. This is just a way of talking and different models and different description. That's it. But but I feel that they are capturing something that is really happening.
Yeah.
And I would like to stress that to the degree that is possible without overshooting and going crazy about stuff that we cannot say properly. And I don't know exactly how to balance this. I know I want to be in this sort of balanced position, but it is pretty tricky.
So, for its worth, I think the position I was stating isn't a like a completely anti-realist position. I think the position that I was trying to go for was saying that, hold on, maybe the real thing that's going on, the onto the like way, the thing that we're like actually reasoning about when we do science isn't something about some thing outside of our experience that we can't understand, but instead is something about like something fundamental about what it is to be a knower in the world. So it's something like it's saying something like, hold on, there is an intrinsic fact of the matter of what a world looks like when you are perceiving it. But there's something where it's like there is no such thing as a world which is not being perceived. And all of this is attempting to get at like fundamentally what it is to be in a world where you know things. And the interesting thing in how this relates to like the fundamental physics things is that like when renormalization theory was like understood more by like Wilson and others in the 70s, there was actually a philosophical reframing from what's happening in particle physics, from particle physics being what actually is to particle physics being
Nice.
the most we could ever know about what is. And that's like that's still a claim about ontology. It's the most we could ever know about what is, but it's
Hmm.
now an ontology which has the point of view of the experimentalist like baked into it on a deep level. It's like a similar move
Nice.
as to what's done in quantum mechanics, for example, which is like, yeah, and I think this is like the point. This is like how I would try to balance this.
Mm. Yeah, I like it.
We have one more question, which is a little bit more technical, which is just what is the relation between emergence and things like sufficient statistics or dimensionality reduction techniques such as SVD or PCA? Like, is emergence a more general way of this, or is it just something else entirely?
That's a very nice question. I think I'm not completely sure about this, but I have a feeling that so the definition of emergence that we're using in the computational part and the definition of emergence that we're using in the information decomposition part, they're not the same. And
Hmm.
I don't know if I stress that enough, but they are different. They have a similar flavor, but they're actually different. So in the case, in this informationally close, computationally close, causally close thing, then it's true that emergence is sufficient statistics. So basically, especially the definition of information closure is a way of defining sufficient statistics, basically. There is I could go a bit more technical, but basically it's equivalent. So you have a coarse graining that keeps everything that is relevant for the prediction you want to do. So it's exactly information sufficient stats. Now, the other definition of emergence that is based on unique information that is equivalent to synergy, that is very different from this. So the way I think about this, and I don't think there is agreement on this yet, but this is my way of saying it for now, is that this type of emergence is a bit simpler in the sense that you require less, but you also get a bit less, because the macro here doesn't have anything that is not in the micro. The whole is not more than the sum of the parts in a way here. It's just sufficient. Like everything that is useful to know at the macro, you have it in the macro, so it's sufficient. But there is nothing in the macro that you couldn't find in the macro.
Yeah.
In the previous case, it's a bit different because you have this thing in the macro that you couldn't find in the micro. Now, of course, so that here it seems to give you something more, but you have to pay a price. And the price you pay is that this not being in the micro is not with respect to the micro per se, it with respect to the micro seen from a parts perspective and only considering parts up to some scale. So you need to put more structure. You need to decompose the micro in number of parts that are sort of coordinates, and then all your statements are related to those coordinates, and you have to fix the order that you are working on, etc., etc. In here, you don't need to deal with parts. You don't need to live with orders. So there are less things that you have to put in, but also, in my opinion, you get a bit less out of it. So in the case of the synergy version of emergence, is not about sufficient statistics. It's something that you can do at the macro that you could not do at the level of the parts when considered up to a given scale. And then it's a bit different from dimensionality reduction, in my opinion. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we're done with questions for now. I think this is a good place to wrap this up. But yes, thank you again, Fernando. This was really, really great.
My pleasure.
We'll put this recording on YouTube if that's okay with you. And we'll put some links to relevant papers that Fernando has written in the description of the YouTube video as well for those watching. So yeah, look out for that. And thank you very much again.
My pleasure.
Bye.